The world has witnessed numerous significant events unfold lately, and today, let us delve into a few of the most pressing matters that require our attention. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like. This really helps us reach more viewers and promotes our content. Also, feel free to share where you're watching from in the comments below. Russia's involvement in the Ukrainian conflict is still marked by a tremendous and ongoing struggle. A significant factor behind this is the staggering number of Russian military losses, which, based on reports from the United Kingdom's intelligence agencies, surpasses 700,000. This total includes those who have been killed, injured, have abandoned their positions on the front lines, and have surrendered. The Kremlin has been increasingly alarmed by this development. Russian President Vladimir Putin even sought assistance from North Korea to offset the significant manpower depletion in his armed forces. As is widely known, the Pyongyang regime dispatched approximately 12,000 troops to the conflict zone, including 1,500 special operations forces for Russia's use. So far, these additional North Korean forces, inclusive of the Storm Corps, have not achieved their desired objectives. Indeed, the Storm Corps sustained almost 1,000 casualties after a Ukrainian aerial assault in the combat zone. Recent casualty figures for North Korean soldiers battling for Russia in this conflict area have been reported to go beyond 3,000, which has greatly dismayed Vladimir Putin. Neither his own armed forces nor North Korean troops are yielding any substantial achievements for the Russian leader. Furthermore, military operations have not been entirely suppressed in that conflict area. Remember to stay with us through the end of this video, because we'll bring everything together with final conclusions that are crucial for understanding this complex situation. In response, Russian President Vladimir Putin reversed his mobilization decision from the 21st of September 2022. Previous mobilizations happened in the Russian Empire during the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, and as World War I commenced in 1914. The Soviet Union mobilized its people and industry in World War II after the German invasion of 1941. Putin broke entirely new ground by announcing a renewed wave of mobilizations in the 21st century to add 300,000 new personnel to the military. The military approach adopted by the Russian leader today is astonishingly similar. Once again, the Russian regime is endeavoring to send 300,000 volunteer soldiers to fight in the Ukraine conflict. Yes, you heard correctly. Putin has made the critical choice to repeat the same error he made in 22 and has declared his intention to send 300,000 of his troops into the heart of the combat. What kind of disastrous outcome will this incredible circumstance, akin to a second wave of mobilization in Russia, lead the nation into? What goals does Putin have for enlisting 300,000 new volunteer troops after the first mobilization wave and the additional soldiers from North Korea? Will this new enlistment model cause further issues for the Russian military? The Russian army is not already in a state of collapse. We'll investigate the answers to all these crucial questions together, examining how the ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia has placed Putin into a position of strategic disadvantage that appears without remedy. We'll also examine where the war might be heading soon, but let's first examine how these new Russian volunteers will be enlisted to join the fight in Ukraine. Presumably, these will be soldiers who lack experience and are undergoing hurried training programs within Russia. Even the head of the training division of the Russian armed forces did not explain when these 300,000 reservists were trained. There's considerable skepticism about this, yet the Russian military leadership insists that they were trained in 2024. Former Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu established 9 reserve battalions to train and prepare contract soldiers to make up for Russian losses in Ukraine by the close of 2023. According to Shoigu, 335,000 individuals signed up voluntarily to fight in 2023. Russia has reported very high losses in personnel and equipment during the war against Ukraine. Since the start of autumn, losses have been steadily increasing, as Russia continued to advance in the Donetsk region, aiming to capture the cities of Pokrovsk and Kurakhove in November alone. More than 45,000 Russian soldiers were injured, killed, or taken prisoner, resulting in the Kremlin's inability to keep participating in military operations. Former President Dmitry Medvedev stated that the numbers of volunteers for military service climbed after these heavy losses. In September 2024, President Putin expanded the size of the active army to 1.5 million, with a potential reserve force of 2 million. Russia is now stating that 300,000 of its active duty personnel will be sent to Ukraine voluntarily. The Russian Defense Ministry has already verified that above 300,000 soldiers have lately signed volunteer contracts to participate in what the Kremlin and state media call the special military operation in Ukraine. It is unclear whether these new volunteers have been trained, and it is also uncertain if they will willingly go to the front lines. Nevertheless, the Kremlin's actions show a significant adjustment in Russia's military approach by leaning on volunteer soldiers rather than large-scale conscription, a situation that reveals that the Kremlin's military structure is deteriorating. Even the head of the Combat Training Directorate of the Russian Armed Forces stated the creation of reserve regiments designed for this purpose had been a success. Yet it seems improbable that a professional army can be replaced by 300,000 volunteers who are not always eager. This is because these regiments are made up of new recruits, willing to serve for a specific contract period, which is an alternative to compulsory service. Volunteer military elements can only increase the Russian army's casualties because they won't receive the required training in combat. Despite the likely rise in losses, this volunteer force is becoming a vital part of Russia's military strategy. It enables the Russian government to muster more forces for the continuing war in Ukraine, without having to resort to broad conscription, which could be politically risky. Volunteer service contracts include specific pay, benefits, and length of service stipulations. The government's dependency on these contracts represents a more expansive trend within the Russian military, aiming to augment their ranks with people who will fight for compensation instead of compulsory service. This could be another component that has the potential to bring about military failure instead of success. There are also growing doubts about whether these 300,000 soldiers that are going to be sent to fight in Ukraine will actually go to the front willingly, given that Russia launched an earlier mobilization campaign and even deployed college students. It is uncertain if these 300,000 volunteers will be subjected to similar coercion. Furthermore, high levels of military casualties and the shortage of basic supplies on the front lines will likely lessen the will of Russian soldiers to participate. But Putin will undoubtedly figure out a way to create a military reserve. Even if these forces do materialize, it will likely be very hard for Russian commanders to keep them on the front lines. The effect of the war on morale and the absence of a clear end make it difficult for commanders to keep their forces together. The Kremlin is also trying to replace soldiers who have abandoned the front lines and those who have been killed or injured. While recognizing the problem of desertion, the Russian authorities are still looking at punishments, despite being aware of the psychological impact this has on their troops. These punishments can include death or harsh prison sentences. No soldier wants to be on the battlefield under such pressures. In fact, Russia already tried a similar strategy for the deployment of additional troops. You might recall how the Wagner Group fought on the eastern front lines to try and make Putin's invasion efforts in Ukraine a success. But look at what happened. The leader of Wagner, who died, launched a revolt against the regime in Moscow because they had a lack of supplies from the Russian army. Although the rebellion failed, Russia's plans for more troops brought about very dangerous situations. Putin seems not to have learned from these past mistakes. Vladimir Putin is still pushing the idea of deploying additional forces in Ukraine. This could be the end of his rule. If more volunteer soldiers join the war and Russia suffers even higher casualties, Putin could have problems suppressing dissenting views inside his own government. As the war goes on, these problems intensify, moving one side closer to a critical point where continuing the war will weaken their position. On the other hand, military production and the capability to make up for losses are quantifiable factors that can be predicted. Russia's list of losses in military resources is long, and so are its casualty figures. Russia's aim to produce 149 T-90M tanks by 2024 was a vital point for Putin this year. Russia lost about 47 T-90M tanks. Somehow the Kremlin had to make this up. Russia also relied heavily on older tanks from its Soviet-era stockpile, like the T-72, T-62, and T-55 models. But, Unexpected missile strikes and drone attacks by Ukraine disrupted Russia's military plans. It turned out that Russia's stock of T-55s fell by 31%, T-62s by 37%, and T-80Bs by 79%, while only 9% of T-72s were removed from storage. Even though these numbers haven't been proven, they show that Russia's tank reserves were declining. While Russia lost a record number of tanks, the Kremlin failed to focus on increasing military production. These losses exceeded Russia's current tank production capability. The total loss of about 3,300 tanks was the main reason for the failure of Russian military production. In addition, the breakdown of the Russian economy also reduced the power of the military and distracted Putin from his goals. Since the illegal seizure of Ukrainian territory in 2014, it has only grown by 1% each year. Russia's GDP has dropped from $2.3 trillion in 2013 to $1.9 trillion in current dollars. As Vladimir Putin's war against Ukraine approaches its third anniversary, Russia faces greater financial, technological, and demographic challenges than is realized. Since 2014, and especially since 2022, the Russian economy has been impacted by strict international sanctions, though the real impact of these is questioned. President Vladimir Putin and his supporters say that sanctions made Russia stronger, but consistently call for all restrictions to be lifted. Many argue that the sanctions have had very little impact, while others argue that the sanctions aren't severe enough. According to experts, current sanctions lower GDP by 2 to 3% annually, which almost condemns Russia to stagnation. The situation could become worse for Putin and could even prevent the war with Ukraine because of economic reasons. At the Yalta European Strategy Conference in Kiev, Ukrainian General Kirilo Budanov said that Ukrainian military intelligence found Russian documents stating the Kremlin wants to sue for peace by the end of 2025 due to economic reasons. Whether true or not, this scenario seems plausible. The financial, technological, and demographic obstacles facing the Russian economy are more formidable than generally understood, and Putin's war has gone down in history. The country has also been affected by declining energy revenues, which is a key sign of economic collapse. Russia has reduced its reliability as an energy provider. The only sectors growing in Russia are military and state infrastructure, where state companies sell to the state at probably overinflated prices. The rest of the economy is stagnant at best. This is similar to what occurred in the Soviet Union. The Russian central bank claims annual inflation is only 99.1%, when the country is facing an interest rate of 19%, which is something that was seen in the Soviet times. The authorities are probably presenting inflation as real growth. Hidden inflation also indicates that Western financial sanctions have been more effective than observers had predicted. Russia's total external debt fell from $729 billion at the close of 2013 to $33 billion at the end of March 2024, while public debt is only 14% of GDP. This does not help Russia much, because they can't borrow internationally. Instead, Russia relies on tax revenues and reserves. Half of its foreign reserves have been frozen in the West since February 2022. Russia's National Wealth Fund has also fallen from $183 billion in 2021 to $55 billion, or 2.8% of GDP, by March 2024, with most of the remaining reserves being illiquid. Due to these limitations, Russia has had to keep its budget deficit to 2% of GDP since the start of the invasion. With a GDP of $1.9 trillion, this deficit costs around $40 billion a year and means the state reserves will need to be used next year. According to Budanov, Russia is raising taxes on personal and corporate income, which won't help much in an economy that isn't growing, and the government won't be able to sell many bonds domestically. Including hidden costs, Russia may spend about $190 billion on the war this year, 10% of GDP. Because of the restrictions imposed by Western sanctions, this may represent a peak. Since Russia can no longer finance a budget deficit, they may have to cut public spending. No longer a superpower, Russia is seen as what the late U.S. Senator John McCain famously called a gas station disguised as a country. Ukrainian intelligence also thinks so. According to reports, the war between Russia and Ukraine could end by the end of 2025 or start of 2026. It is unlikely that Putin will be able to resolve this situation by relying on volunteers. What about the situation in Ukraine? There is an important point that has drawn a lot of attention regarding Ukraine: the chance of deploying European troops or private military contractors to assist Ukraine. This could alleviate the burden on Ukrainian forces. The idea of European nations sending their troops to Ukraine has become an important point in political debate. In particular, French President Emmanuel Macron recently stated that sending ground troops to Ukraine should not be discounted to avoid a Russian victory. His views were met with mixed views across Europe, as many leaders objected to the concept of directly involving their troops. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and Defense Minister Boris Pistorius have clearly stated that NATO should not send troops to fight Russia in Ukraine. Similarly, leaders from Spain, Poland, and Sweden have confirmed they do not plan to send troops, thus strengthening the resistance to a military intervention. At the same time, countries such as Estonia have shown a desire for more military involvement, even though they have not made any firm commitments. The possibility of NATO involvement remains a sensitive matter, given Russia's warnings that this could lead to a confrontation between NATO and Russia that could escalate the conflict to a disaster. The broader implications of this discussion go beyond troop deployment. NATO's involvement, or lack thereof, may shape the future of the war. A NATO ground intervention could give Ukraine the upper hand, but the threat of starting a larger, more destructive war should not be underestimated. This concern is a point of unease for many European leaders and will influence their decisions in the near future. While European governments have pledged to support Ukraine mainly by providing weapons, training, and financial aid, the chances of sending ground troops remains unlikely. Nevertheless, the ongoing nature of the war may force European countries to reconsider their position. Whether NATO will be drawn into the conflict directly or indirectly depends on several factors, which include the performance of Ukrainian forces, the domestic political climate within NATO, and most importantly, the nature of the conflict. This fluid situation leads to questions about the future of international military alliances, the efficiency of volunteer forces in modern conflict, and the psychological and strategic struggles facing soldiers on both sides of the conflict. Relying on volunteers is becoming a part of both countries' strategies. The long-term stability of this model remains to be seen, and the conflict will test the resilience of these forces. If Europe sends troops to Ukraine, this may make a difference, as these troops would be professional. Tests conducted in Ukraine have shown that the concept of volunteer conscription has not worked well for Russia, and Kiev is hoping for military support from Europe. The most likely situation is that Europe will offer even more support to Ukraine, both militarily and financially, to raise the Russian army's casualty rates. So, if Kremlin leader Vladimir Putin sends another 300,000 troops to the conflict, the West may help the Ukrainian army. The primary goal is to stop any additional Russian forces from turning the war in favor of the Kremlin. Therefore, if we see 300,000 volunteer Russian troops moving towards the Ukrainian front lines, we might also see a large number of tanks, military vehicles, and other supplies coming from Europe to Ukraine. There are many indicators that the war in Ukraine has plunged Russia into a military and economic collapse and created a deep crisis. But this is just a small part of the story. How the Russian people feel about the war is a hidden story that can be heard in silent cries across the country. Let's examine the effects of the war from a different perspective and consider Russia's real problem, fleeing the country. Why would Russian citizens emigrate when people have lost their will to live and have no loyalty to their nation? On the first day of the war, when Vladimir Putin ordered Russian tanks into Ukraine in February 2022, there was great anxiety within the country. Russians were probably worried that the war would eventually affect them. Furthermore, Russians may have been ashamed of their country for declaring war on Ukraine, a country that has been a brotherhood for centuries. This is why the first exodus of people from Russia started in the early days of the conflict. Putin has been continuing this war for almost 3 years, ignoring the population decline in his country. The primary reason the country is in such a bad condition, economically and militarily, that it might never recover is that Russian citizens have already abandoned their homeland. It is estimated that more than 1 million Russian citizens have left the country so far because of the war. In the shadow of population decline, undocumented immigrants in Russia are also being deported because of the war. The Russian leader has created a key decree on this issue. Which migrants will Putin's decree affect? When will the Russian leader send undocumented immigrants from the country? Will these undocumented immigrants have a chance to remain in the country? Will Putin use them in the army or military production? How will Russian citizens living abroad deal with this decree on undocumented immigrants? Will they go back to the country or continue to live away from the effects of the war? How will all these scenarios expected after Putin's decree impact the Russian economy and the military structure? We will examine the answers together, but before that, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and give us a like. Vladimir Putin has issued a decree that could make large numbers of people leave the country in 2025, giving undocumented immigrants 4 months to gain legal status. On December 30, the Russian president signed a decree stating that those who entered the country illegally have until April 30 to undergo medical tests, pay any debts, and pass exams in Russian, history, and law. He also made it possible to gain legal status for migrants by signing a military contract that would permit them to fight in the invasion of Ukraine. Undocumented migrants who do not adhere to these regulations will need to leave the country. Many people in Russia are concerned by this decree. With an OECD population of 146 million in 2019, undocumented immigrants made up about 7% of the population in 2021. The Moscow government stated that above 1 million undocumented immigrants from former Soviet nations were residing in Russia. This means that many more are at risk of deportation by Putin's orders. One of Putin's reasons for signing this decree is the possibility that illegal migrants could fill Russia's labor shortage if they meet the required conditions. The war in Ukraine has exacerbated the labor shortage, which is about 1.5 million people. This is due to high casualty rates, the departure of skilled workers fleeing military service, and the restrictive environment. Migrants, mostly from former Soviet countries, are a key part of Russia's economy and work mainly in low-skilled sectors. But if the government forces undocumented migrants to leave or join the army, Putin's orders could add to the problems facing the Russian economy. So what exactly should undocumented immigrants who want to stay do? Those who want to stay will need to have their biometric data taken and have a medical checkup, including the use of banned substances and the presence of diseases such as HIV. Exemptions are available to those who have served in the military. The exemptions do not apply to migrants who pose a threat to Russia's national security. The Russian Interior Ministry will implement the decree, while the Health Ministry will organize the medical examinations. It is important to note that such a decree was issued after an attack in Russia. The Russian authorities stated that they would take action on the migration issue after the attack at the Crocus City Hall in Moscow, which killed 145 people and injured nearly 500. The investigation concluded the perpetrators were from Tajikistan. At the International Economic Forum in St. Petersburg in June, Putin stated his government needed to address its migration policy, specifically because they need migrants to solve the labor shortage. In assessing Putin's decree, it seems the Kremlin prioritizes Russia's military needs and political stability over efforts to ease the economy and labor shortage. In the new year, we already mentioned that Putin's decree says that undocumented migrants must leave the Russian Federation or gain legal status between January and April 20. There are major doubts that these legal processes will be implemented correctly, perhaps because the government wants to add undocumented immigrants to the army. Experts have said that Putin's decree could be altered if large numbers of migrants working in food service, transport, and other sectors leave the country or are forced to join the Russian army. This will worsen Russia's labor shortage, and the integration of illegal migrants into the army will be favored over the economy. Will Putin's decree be strictly implemented? Economists have said that it remains to be seen if the decree will be implemented, and a lot depends on whether labor market challenges are more important to the Kremlin than political pressure to deport migrants. A Washington-based think tank stated that the implementation of the decree would show that the Kremlin is putting the ultra-nationalists' belligerent views and security issues linked to reports of migrants committing crimes above economic concerns. Undocumented immigrants linked to such crimes will be deported. It is more likely they will be recruited into the Russian army. Putin may create a new criminal Wagner-like organization. This could create huge problems for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Remember what happened when Putin deployed the Wagner group on the war front. A second Wagner incident would be a huge disappointment for Putin and could seriously undermine his power. If the decree isn't implemented correctly and becomes a dangerous way to meet the army's recruitment targets, if illegal immigrants and those with criminal links are put into the armed forces, it can be expected that Russians will plan their escape. Because no one wants illegal immigrants, criminals, or drug users in their country. Since Russia is used to these migration waves, the outcome of Putin's decree on illegal immigrants could have a big impact on the population. There have been two distinct waves of migration from Russia, the first in the spring and summer of 2022, and the second after the announcement of partial mobilization in September of 2022. A large number of Russian immigrants have returned, but about 650,000 are still abroad. Countries including Tajikistan, Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, and Turkey are popular destinations for Russian citizens. Would these Russian migrants return if Putin's decision on illegal migrants is implemented properly? And if he ensures that those with criminal links or drug associations are removed from Russia? Conclusion: we've examined a lot of information today, and it is clear that the situation in Russia is complex and evolving. The reliance on volunteer soldiers, the economic pressures, and the potential for further political instability due to the war in Ukraine all point towards a country facing major challenges. The future of Russia is uncertain, but one thing is clear: the decisions made in the coming months will be critical. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like. This really helps us reach more viewers and promotes our content. Also, feel free to share where you're watching from in the comments below.